Okay, now I'll be doing a debriefing session for the first part where you were supposed to analyze the current strategic position. Now, in an exam, how would your thinking process run? Let me tell you that. You have to analyze the strategic position of GET. So for that matter, what you would be doing is you would be going through the case study and you would be thinking about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. You would be thinking about these four aspects. So in the first part as such, what you've been told is that the government has split the railway network into 8 sections or franchises and invited private sector bids for each of these 8 franchises. So when you're told this, what they did is they split the railway network. It was an 8,000 kilometers network, 6,000, sorry, kilometers network, and this was divided into 8 sections, right? 6,000 divided by 8. So there were 8 sections that this railway network was split into, and then they had the private sector bids for these 8 franchises. So I think the threat of new entrant, if I think about Porter's 5 forces, this indicates that potentially the threat of new entrants has increased, right? Threat of new entrants has increased because now threat of new entrants or threat of new entry that has increased. But then again, it is limited, at least those who won the franchises. For them, the threat of new entry is low for 10 years at least. The good news is it's low for 10 years at least. So it's an opportunity actually that the threat, because they have these franchises for 10 years. That's what the scenario tells you. Now it says each franchise would be awarded to the highest bidder. Now when it says to the highest bidder, that's potentially an indicative of the high capital cost of entry. That indicates the high capital cost of entry, and that's going to, prevent those entrants with less capital. I mean, even after 10 years, because highest bidder is going to be awarded, so it is going to create an entry barrier. And entry barriers, they're nice actually because they reduce competition, right? So high capital cost of entry and the net franchise granted for 10 years, there are both barriers to entry, and they're going to reduce, they're helpful in reducing competition. Okay. Besides that, you are told about the financing mode. The financing mode, the GET was primarily financed through loans from the government-owned Bank of Rudolph. Remember, when we, in our orientation session, we talked about linking different pieces of information, the narrative portion and the numbers. So now, because you're told in the scenario that this particular company is debt financed, it means I would expect a high level of gearing, like some of you pointed out earlier. So if there is a high level of gearing, we can calculate gearing as debt divided by debt plus equity, right? So you have this debt number with you, which is $2 billion to be precise, while your equity is 660. So you're highly geared. You can calculate this ratio as 2 billion divided by 2.6 billion, that is debt plus equity. So when you compare it with the industry average, now remember, when you're comparing, there has to be some comparator. And in this case, you've been given the industry averages. So you would be comparing the gearing ratio, and you would see that the industry average is 48%, but your gearing number is way higher than that. So that's a problem. that should be seen as such a high gearing level should be seen as a problem. To be clear, it should be seen as a problem. Why should it be seen as a problem? Because it could create gearing level higher than industry is a weakness actually for the business. It's a weakness. Why? Because that would create difficulties. That would create financing difficulties in future. If an entity has some expansionary plans, I think it would find it difficult to expand because of the fact that it has a very high gearing level. So it would be, the financial risk would be too high and the lenders would be less willing to lend money to this company. So that's a trouble. Then we need to, you've already talked about the skill and knowledge of the management team and their significant operating experience. Now, how you've identified the relevant point. Now, step 2 is very important to develop the identified point. How skill and knowledge and operating experience helpful? That means they have the prior experience can help in effective tackling of business issues. So they can better tackle the business issues because of their prior experience. They can use their prior learning experience, or what we could talk about is the learning curve, effect. The learning that they already have, they can use it to the advantage. Then you've also been told that they have invested in new trains. So for this business, I hope the EMS model, remember the EMS model, we talked about machinery. For this particular business, trains is like a machinery. So new trains with good reliability record. A good reliability record is a plus for the business. I mean, that's a critical success factor for the business. CSF, critical success factor for the business, because that's one of the key factors that customers generally take into account in choosing a service provider. So good reliability record is an excellent critical success factor. It's going to underpin their success. They have a good image. There's brand loyalty. That would encourage brand loyalty and customer loyalty. And that's going to push up your revenues, for example. That's going to be good for your revenues. That's going to be good for your cash flows. I mean, customers would prefer traveling with you. What else? You've been told that in an advertisement, they tell arrived safe and on time. So I mean, punctuality and safety, that again significant, of principal significance. For such businesses, I mean, for such businesses, punctuality, safety have got some principal significance, and that's going to help in long-term, you could say long-term customer retention. And we've talked about in a recent consumer survey, these advertisements were rated as both memorable and effective. If you're told that, that means in terms of value chain, your marketing is nice because customers remember it. So if they're remembering advertisement, that means marketing is nice, and that's going to help in attracting customers. That's going to be useful attraction for the customers. You've already talked about innovative booking and payment system. Now that means, and then internet booking. they've talked about. So internet booking means, and innovative booking and payment system, these are unique resources. You would talk about them in terms of capabilities. These are unique resources because the other organizations, the other franchises do not have this. So unique resources, these booking and payment system. And you see, this unique resources are directly helping the business. How is this unique resource helping the business? The unique resource is helpful in terms of, being a source of other income for the business. It's going to be another source of other income for the business because they're getting the other franchises or franchise operators are actually paying you for this. Someone raised a question regarding this portion of the case study where it talked about automatically reallocating revenue from fares between franchise holders. Remember, we talked about the 6 kilometers track, which has been divided into 8 franchises. So there could be customers who are using more than one, the services of more than one franchise to reach from one destination to another. So that could require the allocation of fares, and that is being done by this system. And so that's a source of other income, and that's a source of, improving the business and its competences. Okay, the 4th, 5th years, they've been bad. They've not been that successful. And now you would see threats from the external environment, pestle, political factors, adverse political factors. Why? Because no subsidy, no more subsidy. Adverse economic climate. Passenger numbers are going to fall because of economic problems, right? So passenger numbers would fall. Numbers falling. Now that's going to create troubles. That's going to create troubles for profits, for revenues, for cash flows for the business. So the political climate, the economic climate doesn't seem to be very favorable for the business. Okay, let's move further. Now, there's some easy marks. Remember, whenever in an exam question, you're given certain ratios for the industry, for the prior period, remember you have to calculate symmetrical ratios, symmetrical numbers for the company under consideration. So for example, while you're given the industry average, because I cannot say in isolation that finance cost is high. I cannot say in isolation that revenue is high or low. I need to have some benchmark. So remember, these are the benchmarks that you've been given, and you would have to compute symmetrical ratios for GET. And after computing those symmetrical ratios, only you would be in a position to compare. You would be in a position to compare the GET's results, the GET's financial position and performance with that of the industry. So you would have to calculate ROAS, operating profit margin, GP margin, current ratio, acid test ratio, gearing ratio, revenue per employee per year, and number of employees per rail kilometers. And then you would have to interpret. You would have to interpret, and you have to interpret the numbers and the ratios very carefully. For example, if you find out that ROAS is low for the business, I would say it's not much of a problem. For the reason, we've been told in this case study that they've invested in new trains. So if they've invested in new trains, fixed assets would be high because only little depreciation would have been charged by now. So fixed assets are going to be high. That means capital employed is going to be high. And when capital employed is high, your return on capital employed for the initial years would be low. And which is very much in accordance with our understanding that an investment reaches its full potential, not immediately, but it takes some time. There's always a lag between investment and the recoupment. The ROAS, even if it is less than the industry average, not necessarily bad. At least they have a better reliability record that's going to help them in the long run, as opposed to companies having accidents. So you have to very carefully interpret your ratios in the light of the other information that you've been given in the case study scenario. Then it talks about operating profit margins. If operating profit margins are not good, are not as good as the industry, then maybe some overheads, administrative costs need to be managed, need to be contained, need to be reduced. Gross profit margin. If gross profit margin is not good, or if it is better, then you need to hypothesize the reason for that. Current ratio, asset test ratio, they're measures of liquidity. How liquid is the business? If they're worse than the industry average, then you need to come up with the potential reasons for that, unless those reasons you can derive from the case study. Lastly, the gearing ratio, we've already talked about it, and we also connected it with the fact that they've been debt financed. They have been debt financed. Revenue per employee. Now, this is a very useful number. One of the students talked about it. Revenue per employee per year. Now, you would have to compute this for GET and then compare, because the higher, the better. Number of employees per rail kilometers. Now, again, that's a measure of productivity. How many employees you need per kilometer? That indicates the efficiency and productivity of your employees. The lesser the number of employees per rail kilometer, potentially the better. But only if customers are satisfied. I mean, if you have less employees per rail kilometer and customers are dissatisfied, then that's a problematic area. Now remember, whenever you're interpreting ratios, never say that ratio has gone up or a ratio is higher or lower. Always say whether it is better or worse than the prior period. Always say whether it is better or worse as compared to the industry. Never say higher or lower, because higher or lower are vague terms. They're unclear terms. Some ratios, if they are higher than the industry, that's a good sign. But some ratios, if they're higher than the industry, that's a bad sign. For example, if gearing is higher than the industry, that's a bad sign. But if profit margins are higher than the industry, that's a good sign. So always remember, you have to use the word better or worse. The second thing that you need to remember whenever you're interpreting ratios is, first, try to find out the reason for the behavior of a ratio from the case study scenario. And if you're not able to locate the precise reason, only then hypothesize as to what could be the potential reason of problems, right? These are the two top tips for you whenever you're discussing ratios in an exam. Okay. Current position. In current position, we've been told that there have been organizations that there has been considerable criticism over the privatization of the railway. And then we've also been told that the leader of the main opposition party has suggested of potential renationalization. Now that's a bad political move. That could be a threat for the business, right? That could be a threat for the business if it is renationalized. Then there have been issues like one of the ministers, he said, terminating the franchise and opening it up to rebidding has not been ruled out as an option. I'm afraid. Remember we talked about the safety of 10 years when we said that the threat of new entry is low for at least 10 years because you have the franchise for 10 years. But now this new development, this statement from the minister, that means the threat of new entrants is increasing. And that's a problem for the business. That could be a problem for the business. So you see, these 5 forces and these the factors that we discussed in PESTEL, they're not static. They're not static. They're not static in the real world. They're not static when we're studying them in case study. They're dynamic. There are changes in those. So initially we were saying threat of new entry is low, but now based on this reading, I'm afraid threat of new entrants is increasing. Then in one of the franchises, a rail accident occurred and now new legislation is being enacted on safety and everything. Why is that a problem for the business? It's a problem for the business because that's going to disturb that's going to increase the compliance cost for the business. Obviously, maybe some new machinery, some new hirings would be required, and that's going to increase the cost of doing business. So the cost of doing business would go up. And if an entity fails to demonstrate compliance with those laws and regulations, then maybe there could be fines and penalties, and the image and reputation of the business would be damaged. So that's going to create a trouble. Now, it's a threat, but it's not a weakness, because it's not GET that has suffered this rail accident. That's why it's not a weakness. If the rail accident pertained to GET, then it would have been classified as a weakness. So try to understand the difference between a weakness and a threat. Weakness is company specific. Threat is industry, outside the company. Then this is a very important point. Road transport has suffered under PNR government, with many of the roads in the country heavily congested. Think about Porter's 5 forces. Think about the threat of substitutes. Remember, we talked about threat of substitutes in Porter's 5 forces, where we talked in detail about how another product or another service that meets the same need as your service could be a substitute. So I think you all would appreciate that rail and road are substitutes. Road and rail are substitutes. But here you have an advantage. Advantage in the sense that the threat of substitutes is actually low. Threat of substitutes is low. And why is it low? Because road transport is not good enough. So that's an opportunity for rail network to perform well and to improve its revenues and cash flows. Increasing fuel costs, that's something that's happening in the external environment, adverse economic factor, but that's going to create trouble for the business. That's going to increase the cost of doing business. That's going to have a direct impact on the cost of business or cost of sales. Then ecology, green party. Remember the ecological factors or the environmental factors in pestle. Now they're not, there's a growth of green consumers. If the GET doesn't have if GET has a adverse environmental footprint, that's going to put it in trouble. I mean, customers may not prefer using it. Customers may use other modes of start using other modes of transportation even, and it would be viewed, GET would be viewed as an unethical company. And if it is viewed as an unethical company, I mean, even the employees would prefer not to associate with it, would not seek employment. So it would be difficult from multiple perspectives. From the perspective of multiple stakeholders, it could be a trouble.